Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. The United States officially notified the United Nations on Monday that it is pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. This move does not come as a surprise, given U.S. President Donald Trump's attitude towards climate change throughout his presidency. He's made it clear he doesn't think climate change is alarming, and frankly, he still doesn't believe it's happening. But now that this move is actually happening and this agreement is actually, the United States is actually exiting from it, what lies ahead for the global fight against climate change, and what can the world do without the United States? That's our discussion. Joining us on the show is Professor Srinivas, Professor of Global Environmental Policy, joining us from the Kansai Gakuin University from Kobe. We're also joined by Dr. Peiser, who's the director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Srinivas, I'd like to begin with you. Now, as I said, it's not surprising, this move, and we've been expecting it to happen for a long time. But does this mean anything significant now that the United States has officially notified the United Nations?
Yes, thank you. It's a little difficult to unpack that whole decision because it is a national decision. It's a country-level decision. But if you look at it from a UN perspective, the decision doesn't really affect the climate action as a whole, basically because what we are actually doing at the global level is trying to localize it. And if you look at it from a localization perspective, what is more important and what is more encouraging is that cities and businesses at the local level in the U.S. are taking action themselves.
Right.
So yes, this is going to be a disaster for the leadership roles that the U.S. had played in the past. But the real future for the Paris Agreement will lie with the uptake with cities, with businesses, with civil society entities at the local level, and the real action that will happen at the micro level.
Right. Professor Srinivas, now you mentioned here that it might not impact the global fight against climate change. But just to mention here, the United States didn't represent just a symbolic power in all of this. The United States is, of course, one of the main contributors to the emissions we're seeing. And in 2018, its emissions rose 3.1%. So, of course, whatever is happening, it does play a key role in the contribution of it all. Dr. Peiser, I'll take my question to you. Do you also agree that won't really change anything, given that the United States has said, look, this isn't our problem, we don't want to be involved in it?
I don't think it will change very much because this has been known for some while that the US is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. I think the Paris Agreement is facing much more severe problems other than the withdrawal of the US, namely that only 2 countries currently are actually trying to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And most countries are paying lip service. This is a legally non-binding agreement. So governments are paying lip service and are actually not introducing the kind of radical decarbonization they pledged, not least because there are popular uprisings in many countries whenever energy prices are rising steeply. We've seen the protests in France, we've seen protests in Ecuador, protests in Chile, and energy prices play significant role in these protests, and governments are beginning to be concerned.
Right. Dr. Peiser, I have a couple of questions after your comment there, but before that, I want to show a little video of what Donald Trump said when he decided to pull out of the Paris Agreement in 2017. Let's hear it together.
Begin negotiations to re-enter either the Paris Accord or in really entirely new transaction on terms that are fair to the United States, its businesses, its workers, its people, its taxpayers. So we're getting out, but we will start to negotiate, and we will see if we can make a deal that's fair. And if we can, that's great. And if we can't, that's fine.
So, Dr. Peiser, President Donald Trump makes some heavy statements there that it's a burden on the taxpayer, it's a burden on the economy. Now, if you say that all countries are just paying lip service, why did the United States, do you think, it found it essential to pull out of this agreement in the first place? Why couldn't it just stay in the agreement for its international image?
The problem, as I see it, is that there was a pledge to give $100 billion every year to the developing world. And it was clear that almost all of it, or most of it, would have to come from the US. So basically, the US was expected to do the heavy lifting and be mainly responsible for the financial transfer of huge funds on an annual basis. And I think that was one of the key issues. The Trump administration was concerned, this pledge to give $100 billion every year, well, for an indefinite time to the rest of the world.
Right.
And I think that.
So, Dr. Peiser, it does seem if each country was expected and is expected to pledge $100 billion, the Paris Agreement, at the end of the day, does hold some significance in terms of capacity building with developing nations. On that point, I'd also like to introduce another guest who's just joined us, Mr. Chandra Bhushan, who's the CEO of the International Forum for Environmental Sustainability and Technology. He joins us from Delhi. Thank you so much, Mr. Chandra, for joining us. Now, as I've been talking about it, and I do want to get to the bottom of this, do you also feel like the Paris Agreement doesn't have any inherent value, given the fact that most countries are just paying lip service and the United States pulling out of it doesn't really matter?
I think we need to get our facts right. The fact is, Paris Agreement was designed for United States. The Obama administration made Paris Agreement voluntary because it wanted to bypass the Congress. So Paris Agreement was designed for US and it met all the criteria of the US. So Donald Trump walking out of the Paris Agreement has nothing to do with inherent weakness of the agreement, or say, for example, as Dr. Binney said about some financial contribution, and I'll come back to that point. The fact is he has walked away because he's a Republican president. He is catering to his own vote bank politics. It has nothing to do with, let me just repeat it again. It has nothing to do with economics. It has nothing to do with taxpayer. It has nothing to do with what responsibility US would have taken under the Paris Agreement. So I think we need to get our facts right. Point number two about US giving $100 billion, developed world has never given developing country even $10 billion properly. Though under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they always signed onto a paper saying that they are going to support least developing countries and other countries with technology and finance. That has never materialized. So this whole idea that US is going to do heavyweight lifting and give $100 billion is as big a mirage as the idea that Donald Trump is an environmentalist. So I think
that's not a mirage. I think everyone pretty clearly knows that he is a climate change denier, given his stance on climate change. Professor Srinivas, now, Mr. Chandra made some interesting points there. Do you agree with all of them?
Yeah, I think the key point here, there are two issues, as both the other panelists have been saying. One is the domestic politics of climate change in the US. The second is the global issues that have been raised. I think the key point here is how climate policy has been significantly politicized both as a party politics, but also as the way in which business lobbies have been trying to influence climate politics against scientific advice, against data that clearly shows that climate is indeed changing. I think that's what we need to keep in mind there. We need to separate these two issues of domestic politics that's happening within the U.S. and the global movement towards coherent climate policy. You have to understand that the very fact that we have a Paris Agreement in itself is significant. And as the other panelists have rightly raised, it is a voluntary agreement in the sense that nobody is sitting down at the UN and saying, you should do this, you should do that. It is a national plan that the whole point of Paris Agreement is that every country takes its own action. And if it doesn't, so much the loss for climate policies, because countries will, for the sake of the UN, will say promise and sign the agreement, but when they go back to their capitals, usually hesitate in terms of taking real action, again because of domestic politics. The point is how do we use this opportunity that Paris Agreement brings up in terms of shaping domestic policies? And that's the real challenge. That's what we always discuss at the UN. How do we take these global policies and, as I said earlier, localize it even further down to the local level than the country level? In the US, even though Trump is making all these noises, we have to understand that Trump is going to, at the most, be around for the next 4 years, if at all. So we have what climate change is going to be here for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So we have to understand, keep this shorter-term issues in mind while we look long-term.
Right. Dr. Peiser, jump back to you and talking about something that you mentioned earlier, that the Paris Climate Accord in itself does have several weaknesses, and the United States pulling out of it shouldn't distract us from all of those. Take us through which one of those you feel are the most essential to take notice of.
Well, the biggest flaw of all, of course, is that it's not legally binding. And that means that governments can basically do what they want. The second flaw is that most countries are saying they're not cutting CO2, they're increasing CO2 because they want to develop economically, and because economic development goes hand in hand with increase in energy demand, CO2 emissions are rising. So despite the agreement being now 4 years old, CO2 emissions are rising, and all international energy analysts are suggesting that they will continue to rise for years to come. So they're clearly the main goal of the Paris Agreement of cutting CO2 emissions is clearly failing. And many countries, including are saying our economic development has priority over CO2 emission cuts. It's economic development, it's competitiveness, it's energy security that are the main priorities for most governments. And that's what I said. The governments are paying lip service, but in reality, they're not doing very much.
Right. Mr. Chandra, on that point specifically, now, last year I talked about how emissions were rising, and China, the United States, and India contributed to 70% of this increase. India's emissions increased by 4.5%. And now what we see in India, in Delhi right now, is a crisis of sorts in terms of air pollution and everything that is unfolding. Do you think countries on their own, and specifically the countries that had such high emissions last year and that are facing such crises right now, have realized that their own national tactics need to change for the future?
I think there is obviously a co-benefit between acting on climate change and local environmental benefit. If we are going to reduce our emissions from coal-based power plant, It is going to, improve our air quality as well as it will reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. So there is a co-benefit element here that needs to be understood. And I think that India is quite aware of this fact. In fact, that is the reason why we now have one of the most ambitious renewable energy targets in the world. India is now very clearly realizing that depending on fossil fuel for electricity is not going to work. We are also trying to think very seriously about electricity mobility. How do we bring electric cars and buses on the road? As I am talking to you, one of the states in India has just announced that they are going to move to all electric bus in next 10 years. So think about the transition and the possibilities of this leapfrog transition that can happen in developing countries. But leaving that issue, I want to come back to the issue of how do we get moving on the global cooperation on climate change. Now, it is very important to understand that even today, with so-called China emitting about 20%, 25% of the global emissions, India about 7-8%, developed world, with about 20-25% of the population, still contributes 50% of the emissions. In fact, there is no evidence that their consumption-based emission is going down. So I think this needs to be understood. One is generation-based emission, which is how much you produce within your own territory from factories and farmland and transport. But developed world depends hugely on importing products from outside. And there is no evidence that their consumption-based emission is going down. So I think we need to develop countries, before they point finger to the developing countries, have to get their house in order.
Right.
And I'm not saying developing countries don't need to do. In fact, developing countries need to leapfrog. We don't have to repeat the mistake the developed world has done. But that doesn't mean that developed one can sit tight, do nothing, and accuse developing countries.
Mr. Chandra, but here is I agree with you. Whatever you're saying, I agree with you. But here's where the problem lies, and it lies considerably. Now, it is amongst the developed world where the power is concentrated in terms of making policies and making a global impact. And yet, when it comes to climate change, we do know that it is parts of the developing world that are facing the most severe consequences of it. Now, there is a great disparity between the lived experiences of what is happening. In this, it's good to talk about that they should realize, but do you see that happening?
I think, so one of the indicator is how much how much energy you consume or how much emission you do per unit of GDP, gross domestic product. At the current income level, most developing countries are far more efficient in producing GDP than the developed world when they were at our level. So I think you need to understand one thing, that we have an advantage of having modern technology and efficient technology, and we also have an advantage of leapfrogging. As I said, we need not go on internal combustion engine. We can move to electric mobility. Right. In the next 5 to 10 years, renewable energy and battery storage is going to be as cheap as coal-based power plants. So we need not construct new coal-based power plant. And I think most governments in developing countries, considering that the impact of climate change is going to be huge on them, is now realizing this issue.
Right. Mr. Chandra, you're making some very important points here. How countries have more potential to become more green, how they have more space to invest in renewable energy. But there's a point that you mentioned earlier, and I think it's worth going back to. I'm going to take this question to Professor Srinivas and talk to him about it. Now, Mr. Chandra mentioned how developed nations rely on developing nations for trade. And of course, we know about the globalized trade system. When we're talking about climate change and the economy, it seems like it is very essential to bring about the concept of trade into the picture. How do you think this needs to change for a more sustainable future?
Well, absolutely. No, there's no doubt about it. For example, right here in Japan, if you consider the fact that more than 60% of the food we eat is actually in calorific terms, is imported from outside the country. you will realize immediately that the lifestyle of the Japanese, the environmental impact of the Japanese lifestyle is not here in Japan. It's somewhere far away in Australia, in US, and China, where the food really comes from. So trade absolutely will play a very important role in operationalizing climate policy. There are two issues here. One is how we influence the business decisions using a very aware customer, a customer that is aware of climate policy and wants to do something about it. That's one way we can and should influence business decisions when it comes to being environmentally friendly or climate friendly. The second is how we can influence international trade, what is called an extended producer responsibility, where each business. Sorry.
Professor Srinivas, I've noted down those, but I do, since we're running short on time, I want to jump to Dr. Benny Peiser and I want to pick up with him on this point. Dr. Peiser, you mentioned earlier how developing nations, of course, would rather go towards development than care about the emissions. But as I talked to Mr. Chandra about it as well, developing nations, especially those in this region, Pakistan, India, are also seeing how that impacts their environment. I mean, the air is becoming toxic. Delhi has become a gas chamber of sorts. So, of course, they want to take control of the situation. In all of this, can trade be used as a tool to move towards more climate-friendly, more environmental-friendly policies? Do you think that's an option?
Well, first of all, it's important to point out that the air pollution in Delhi and other big cities in Asia has nothing to do with CO2 and the climate. This is to do with old power stations that either need to be replaced by new ones, like we did in Europe. So these are two different issues. One is to clean the air and have clean air and clean water, and the other is to reduce CO2. These are two different issues, and the Chinese are already building all their new coal-fired power stations in a way that no longer pollutes the air because they are very clean. And I guess India will do the same. After all, India is planning to double its coal production in the next 20 years. So I guess the solution to air pollution will be to have a much better, of course, they're much more expensive, these power plants, but to clean up the pollution coming from power plants.
Right. On that point, we've run out of time for this segment, unfortunately, but thank you so much, Dr. Benny Peiser, for joining us from London. Thank you, Mr. Chandra Bhushan, for joining us from Delhi, and Professor Srinivas for joining us from Kobe. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we take a closer look at the internet bans around the world during times of unrest. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, as protests intensify in Iraq and the death toll rises, the government cracks down on the protesters and their medium of communication. NetBlock's Internet Observatory shows that internet access has been cut across much of Iraq. Now, internet shutdowns in a globalized world are detrimental, and authoritarian governments often resort to this measure during times of unrest. On today's show, we take a closer look at the wider implications of this. Joining us for this discussion today, Jamal, El-Ahmad, consultant in strategic intelligence and the Middle East and North Africa Regional Director for Relief Systems International. He's joining us from Accra, Ghana. Also joining us is Mr. Patrick Oyet, our correspondent from South Sudan. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Jamal El-Ahmad, I'd like to begin with you. Now, as we're seeing more and more protests unfold in the world, we're also seeing a crackdown from authoritarian governments become more and more stringent, more and more violent. What role does blocking the internet play in all of this?
Well, it's pretty simple. If the government can block the public's access to communication and coordination, they can somehow limit their activities, their protests. But what we're seeing here in Iraq and Lebanon is that these are spontaneous demonstrations and protests, protesting the status quo. Yes, regimes do sometimes curtail communications. They try to circumvent the laws they've established, actually. But it doesn't usually work because these demonstrations are initiated by the public, by the challenges they're facing. The demands have been quite simple: corruption, the poor public services, unemployment, and the increased internal affairs manipulation by the Iranian regime. So their
Right.
grievances are very, very, very legitimate. So
Right.
it's been a common play now across the region.
Right. Mr. Ahmed Jamal Al-Ahmad, from what I gather from what you've told me, it is a way to, of course, trying to disrupt the communication flow amongst the protesters. But I do want to understand the deeper cause of it. Why, even though the United Nations says that this is a basic human right, it has gone out past a resolution regarding it, governments go against this and do it in a world that is so globalized. Information still reaches us. Why they find that necessary. But before we talk about that, we're also joined by Mohammed Hussain, who's the policy director at Iraqi Center for Policy Analysis and Research, an independent research center. He joins us from Suleimania in Iraq. Thank you so much, Mr. Hussain, for joining us. Before we move on to our discussion and talk about this move being taken by so many governments, I would like to get a sense of the on-ground situation in Iraq right now.
So the situation so far has not changed on the ground. If you look at the streets of Baghdad and the other major cities of Iraq like Basra, Karbala, Diwania, Nasiri, and Najaf, there are lots of protesters, and they are still sitting on the streets, and they are still insisting on their demands and calling for the radical reform that have been calling for since the early day of the protests. So all the Iraqi authorities have done in terms of the cracking down on the protesters, shutting down internet companies and internet lines. So far, they haven't affected any protester to leave the streets and go home. They haven't changed anything on the ground, actually. Contrary to what they expected, they pushed more people to join the protesters because once they shut down the internet line, the family members, relatives, friends of the protesters are thinking about bad things. They are afraid bad things to happen to their sons, to their daughters on the street. So they join them. So the security measures Iraqi authorities have used to crack down on the protesters actually escalated the protests and the tensions on the street and pushed more people to join the protesters.
Right.
So what we can
Mr. Hussain, could you let us know now, in terms of internet shutdowns and communication blockades, how frequent has this been, the government cracking down on these mediums of communications ever since protests began in October?
Well, several times since the early day of October and when the protest started, several times the Iraqi authority and security institutions shut down internet companies and even sometimes telephone networks, hoping to disrupt the connectivity between protest organizers and disrupt the connection that protest organizers have from Baghdad to the other cities. But
right.
They failed. They failed to decrease the level of protests, and they actually just adding in salt to injure. They just pushed more people to join the protesters.
Right.
And
it just gets the momentum building when these restrictions are imposed on the people. I get what you're saying there, Mr. Hussain. Mr. Patrick Oyet, I'd like to jump to you and talk about the situation as it unfolded in Sudan in June, when protests and a revolution of sorts erupted in that region. There too was an information blackout, one that the information of that blackout specifically spread like wildfire throughout social media. What was the on-ground situation at that point in time when that happened?
Yeah, it at that time became difficult for protesters to mobilize themselves. It became also difficult, for example, aid agencies that used to help those who would be injured during the protest. It became difficult to coordinate aid activities. It became also difficult for hospitals to access, people, because communication became very difficult. But as the previous speakers have said, at the end of the day, this cutting off communication or shutdown of internet has proved actually not to work, because yes, the internet is very important. It helps people in the to use social media to mobilize for these demonstrations. But we have seen, not only in the Sudan, but first of all in the Sudan, the time of former President Omar al-Bashir, he also tried to shut down the internet. It just didn't work until he was ousted in April. Later, when the Transitional Military Council came in June, as you rightly said, they shut down the internet. It just never stopped the protesters from going on with their protests. Yes, challenges became apparent, but still they could use the telephones to call their colleagues. They could use short messages sent to their colleagues. And of course, the protests continued. And also the government was trying actually to make sure that there was no communication between those who are in Sudan and those who are outside Sudan. And also to try to block the news coming from outside Sudan, because they knew that inside the Sudan they could control the news that was going out. But the objective news, fair news, balanced news from outside, and people would watch. So they were trying also to block that from coming in through the internet, but it never helped. The protest went on and on and on until we have reached where we are now with the Sovereign Council in the Sudan. So it has proved time and again, even in Egypt, it was the same. Even in Tunisia, governments would try to block internet, but it just never works. Once it has reached a point where people are already on the street, they are protesting, blocking the internet, shutdown of internet never helps.
Right. Mr. El-Ahmad, as we're hearing, you have also stated, Mr. Hussain has also stated, and Mr. Oyet has also reinforced the same point, that these internet bans only create more momentum. But the point here that Mr. Oyet mentioned is an important one, that governments don't just ban internet for mobilization of protesters. It's also for the inflow of information. Now, we do know, while we're speaking, as this happens in Iraq, Kashmir is also another example in which there is a complete communications blackout. How important do you think authoritarian governments find this to happen during times of conflict, to create a narrative or to put out a propaganda of sorts, to solidify their own narrative by repeating the same message and not letting an inflow of information?
Well, you have to understand the primary objective here is when governments block internet and communication platforms is to seize control of the narrative and to propagandize what's happening. So the more, like you said, the more they repeat that propaganda, the more they manufacture their news and control the narrative and repeat it over and over, becomes sort of, let's say, the truth, so to speak. And when the public, news media or local civil society organizations cannot respond in time to actually correct the narrative, then they become, there's a problem. But again, like all the analysts have been saying, there's a blowback, because for the demonstrations to stop, it doesn't depend on communications blockages or internet. These are organic protests. They are fundamentally rooted in deep challenges of public sector corruption, of unemployment, of foreign interference in local politics. So there is a deep-seated issue here that the government cannot control, they cannot fight, and it's important for them to control the narrative immediately and quickly.
Right. And how do you see events unfolding in all these places that we're seeing protests erupt, specifically for the problems you've mentioned, these real grievances of the people, which are linked to economic unrest, this global age of protest that many people are referring to it, do you see a new time being ushered in?
I do think that protests are now no longer limited by instant communication, because in these, let's speak of it specifically in the Middle East. These are organic protests. The people come out on the street regardless, and the very fact that the governments and regimes are trying to impede communication only reaffirms the protesters' grievances and makes them come out even more, making them more angry. So we have to understand that there's a blowback, but unfortunately governments seem to react as opposed to have solid and plausible policy changes that respond to the needs of the people.
Right. Mr. Mohammed Hussain, at this point in time, what are the protesters' demand, and how far do you think they've come in terms of getting the government to act upon those demands, take those seriously, and negotiate with them?
They're actually demanding like good governance, more accountability, and like having employment opportunities, and like putting like some limits to the public the corruption in the public institutions. But the problem is they don't trust the current ruling class to be able to like deliver some reform plan, or some actually half of their promises to meet these demands. This is the big crisis in Iraq. There is a huge gap between what the current government can do and what the current ruling class can do and what the protesters are expecting. And there is also lack of trust between the both sides. Therefore, even though President Barham Saleh and other leaders of Iraqi government, Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi, promised to meet most of the protesters' demands, but the protesters are still in the streets and they don't believe their promises. They don't believe this ruling elite can meet their promises, and they can reform some basic institutional issues that we have in Iraq.
Right.
So that's why, as much as promises that the government officials are making to address the protesters' demand, the level of the protest in the street is going up, and the tension is also increased between the protesters and security forces.
Mr. Patrick Oyet, we've been talking about how protests have been holding across the world, and they're ongoing right now. Now, Sudan, in hindsight, when you look at it, how do you think it impacted the society and the civilian infrastructure, these protests? How did they meaningfully change the community as a whole?
Yeah, a lot of change has happened, and first of all, the population have realized that they have a voice and they can actually change events in the country. In most cases, people go for elections. For example, if you look at the former President Omar al-Bashir, he had been in power for 30 years. He had been winning elections. Many people were complaining that those elections were not free and they were not fair. So people somehow at one point lost hope. They saw like they did not have actually power to change what was going on in terms of elections, in terms of democracy. But the virtue of the fact that they came out in large number, they were able to oust President Omar al-Bashir, gave them more morale. That's why even when the Transitional Military Council took over power, they went on and continued protesting until their voices were listened to. Finally, a negotiated settlement was made, and the government which is in power now is a government that came as a result of negotiations between the representatives of the protesters and the Transitional Military Council, and they have formed the government, which also is going to be run on rotational basis. So it has given hope for people. It has given actually an insight to people that, you know, as people, we have power, we can change governments, and the governments that are there should know that they are there for the people. So in as much as there might be issues of corruption, there might be issues of nepotism, issues of marginalization, the government, whichever government is in power, should also know that at any point, people can actually rise up against it, and it will not have any voice, it will not have any other option but to leave power, because the power belongs to the people. So people have known this. It is clear now to the people of the Sudan that they have powers in their hands, yes.
Right. And what do you see lying ahead for Sudan now at this point in time?
It is looking positive because now there are also armed groups that are still, of course, in Darfur, in Blue Nile, in Nuba Mountains. And these armed groups now have actually signed a roadmap, a declaration of principle, saying that they are not now going to fight. They have declared a cessation of hostilities. They will not attack each other in the media, and they will work towards peace. The peace process is on. They are supposed to resume the peace talk in South Sudan's capital, Juba, in about 2 weeks' time. So all is looking positive because the transitional government now in power is also working to ensure that United States of America remove Sudan from the list of terrorist sponsors. So in order to do that, they have to bring peace to the entire Sudan. So they are working to ensure that they have an agreement with the armed groups. They bring them on board to the government so that, you know, all is looking good for the Sudan.
Right. And that's, of course, a very optimistic picture you paint for Sudan there. And it's, of course, one that is promising. Mr. Ahmed, Jamal El-Ahmad, just a last question to you before we wrap up. Now, we're talking about a globalized community in all of this. And we've talked about how the internet is used by governments in times of protests and revolts. But how do you see the internet being used as a tool to exploit people or the international community as a whole by authoritarian governments?
Well, it's not unheard of. I mean, this has been happening since the last 10 years. You see disinformation campaigns, misinformation campaigns, and a lot of this is propagated by regimes and their allies with internal domestic. Unfortunately, it serves to muddy the waters. It serves to cast blame on anyone who is opposed to the government. So the only most effective way to challenge this is to continuously report, for the media and the civil society organizations to continuously show up and correct the narrative, correct the mistakes, and perhaps maybe even safeguards in terms of instant response to government narratives and the stories that come out.
Right. Mr. Hussain, on that same point, how do you feel like in this globalized community, the governments are exploiting some of these tactics in order to change the landscape?
Unfortunately, what we have seen in Iraq is like very, very bad way of manipulating internet companies and internet networks in Iraq. It is very counterproductive. It just like hugely damages some online businesses in Iraq, and so it's terribly damaging Iraq's economy. It never served the security purpose the government officials and authorities wanted to shut down internet companies for. It just like hard the people who depend on the online business and online marketing, but it never served anyone. It never like helped decrease the level of the protests and the tensions in the Iraqi streets. So unfortunately, it's a very bad and old-fashioned authoritarian ways that the Iraqi authorities are using right now, and even in the other places, other countries and contexts. We saw this wrong tactic like authoritarian regimes usually use. They want to disrupt people from getting together and like have their joint.
Mohammed Hussain, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our show, but I do take your point there. Of course, disrupting the internet is not just disrupting protesters, their mobilization, their way of organization. It's also disrupting the economy. It's also a way of spewing out misinformation and propaganda, which, of course, can't be hidden for long, given how globalized our age has become and how fast news spreads. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining us today. Mohammed Hussain for joining us from Somalia, Mr. Ahmed, Jamal El-Ahmad for joining us from Accra, Patrick Oyet for joining us from South Sudan. We'll see you next week with more stories. Do make sure to follow us on our social media, indus.news. Till then, goodbye and take care.